You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello, everybody. It's Bielawski with another edition of Catholic Mysticism, where we talk about all things of our supernatural aspect of our faith and questions regarding our faith and current event and topics that include our faith. And a lot's happened since our last show, and I just want to thank everybody because November 8th I was ordained in the Catholic Church as a deacon after 5 years of study, and I want to thank everybody for their prayers and support, and a special thank you for my wife, who certainly helped me along with the journey. If it wasn't for the Holy Spirit and my wife, Cynthia, I would not have been able to do this with their encouragement and their help and their insight. So I want to thank them. And it was an exciting journey, a beautiful, beautiful Mass, and I'm very excited about serving the church as a deacon. So please keep me in your prayers, and that I could be a holy and good deacon and serve the people, and as Jesus did, wash the flock's feet as he did, Jesus, to his disciples. So, and pray for humbleness and humility. So again, thank you for your prayers and support, and I really appreciate it. God bless you. So today's show, we're going to continue from the last show I did on a novel, and we're going to continue. We did Dracula last time and all the Catholic symbolisms and the meanings and of the book Dracula, which has been, again, co-opted by modern readers and modern critics. And we are going to do the other side now, Frankenstein, because Dracula and Frankenstein and the horror genre are pretty much a 1-2 punch. And it's very interesting in Frankenstein because it's a classic mad scientist story. And we're going to take a look at that, and I want to thank the insights of Joseph Pierce, who's a very famous author, and does some great works. If you've never read any of his books, you need to pick some of them up. Mr. Pierce is certainly a brilliant mind. And I think the other sources for this show, what I want to do is dedicate this show, since it has to do with science and scientists, is to a friend of mine, Lee, and his friend, Susan. Lee is a scientist and a very brilliant one, and Susan is a tremendous artist, and they both have a love of science art and science fiction. So I want to dedicate the show to them, and because art and science, we learn a lot of things from art emotionally. It touches us in our hearts, in our spirits, in our soul. And science takes our intellect and brings us to certain places with that intellect. So, it's a good combination. And that being said, some of the other shows we've done with science and faith, we need to realize it shouldn't be either or. It shouldn't be either science or faith, but it should be and in both, because faith and reason go hand in hand, and so does science. It's a tragedy, really, that we have this division and these walls set up between faith and science when both, can enhance. Science can be enhanced from a theological perspective, and theology and our faith can be enhanced by science. So, with that being said, maybe, we can try and close up that gap in the disunity and work together to do great things for God and, in turn, for mankind. Okay. That being said, let's take a look at Frankenstein, because like Dracula, it's been used and co-opted, as I mentioned, in many ways, from a feminist standpoint, both books, for misanthropy, all kinds of things in Frankenstein, that's for science to be above God, and you don't need God, and certain agendas that are throughout the novel that people have used for their agenda. And we've got to watch these things because, the classic books, whether it be the Iliad or Dracula, Frankenstein, some of the classics that Jane Austen wrote, we need, another one that comes to mind is Uncle Tom's Cabin. We need to realize that what those authors at that time frame that they lived in were trying to make the point. They weren't writing for people in the 21st century and with our mindset and our particular problems. And for us to do that is an injustice. So we need to read the classics. They're important to read the classics. And a personal opinion is that I think, when we don't read them, we do ourselves some harm because we don't learn. And the classic novels have much to teach us, as do the cultures that came before us. They really do. And we make in a society and civilization many of those mistakes they did, and we can learn from them to avoid it, but, I guess it's human weakness where we don't really do that. Anyway, let's continue on here. Because Joseph Pearce argues, and I think it's a great argument, that we need to look at the author, in this case, Mary Shelley, and what was going on in her life and the influential factors on why she wrote Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein came out of a dare, of a bet, and we'll touch on that. So we're going to look at what Mary Shelley's life was, because she was a young girl, and like many people, unfortunately, was surrounded by tragedy. And these were hard-hitting tragedies. She experienced the death of her first child in early infancy. And two of her closest friends, or intimate relations, committed suicide. And on top of this, Shelley also had her own personal demons she was dealing with. Now, this was a time during her lifetime that religion, science were coming to a period where it looked like they were going to oppose each other because of certain personal beliefs of people. Her father had an atheistic philosophy. He didn't believe in anything. And a matter of fact, her lover, who was Shelley, Percy Shelley, he was an iconoclast. So you see these philosophies of this time in the novel Frankenstein. And authors and philosophers that influenced Shelley, such as Rousseau, Milton. And then on top of this, as I mentioned a moment ago, you had science and the Industrial Revolution as a 1-2 combination that created conflict in society and in Mary Shelley herself. And it was a romantic age, and poetry was very, very popular. And Byron, a friend of Shelley's, and Percy Shelley, that was Mary Shelley's lover, they had this antagonism of a romanticism that they shared, Byron and Shelley, against poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge. And they were a lighter one, the former. And the latter, Shelley and Byron, were a dark type of poetry. And Shelley was caught, Mary Shelley was caught in the middle of all this. So a lot of factors are coming at Mary Shelley, including, as I mentioned, that industrial age and science. And we'll explore that a little bit. But let's take a look at this, because a lot of that I just mentioned is in the novel that Shelley wrote. Now, when we look at Mary Shelley's life, to say that it would have been conventional is a understatement, and quite a bit so. Because Mary's father, and his name was William Godwin, was an atheist, as I mentioned. And worse, he believed that the institution of marriage was, in his words, the worst of all laws. Now, Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was one of the first feminists of her age. And when you look at the two people that should have been the greatest influence, that should have given the greatest protection to Mary, then you have some problems. And it was an unconventional relationship, and for Mary Shelley, she, in her life, wanted some conventionality, and it just didn't happen. Because her family that she grew up in consisted of her father, the father's remarried wife, as I mentioned, Mary Wollstonecraft, so a stepbrother and a stepsister and a half-sister. And you can see this very unconventional family influenced Mary Shelley's writings, influenced her yearnings. So when Mary was 15 years old, she met Percy Shelley. And this was the first time she met him. Now, Percy Shelley, had just married Harriet Westbrook. And this was in the year 1812. Now, soon, Harriet Westbrook was with child, 2 years later, in 1814. And Percy Shelley then decided he would leave his wife and a 1-year-old child he had, and he fled with the 16-year-old Mary Shelley. Because Mary Shelley at this time was also with child. So you can see, again, this unconventional relationships in Mary Shelley's life. Now, so Percy Shelley hits the road. Harriet Shelley, his wife, gives birth to their second child in February. Mary gives birth to a daughter who dies within a few days. And again, you can see that these tragedies are going to shape her views and her writing in Frankenstein. Now, in the summer of 1816, Mary and Percy visited Lord Byron at Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And they were reading ghost stories, German ghost stories. And this is where the Frankenstein novel would have its beginning, because Byron challenged Mary, Percy, and a physician that was visiting them, John William Hildori, to compose a story. Now, Byron responded to his own challenge. He began to write about vampire legends that he had heard while he was traveling in the Balkans. Now, Byron gave up, but Polidori, he actually wrote The Vampire, which he published in 1819. And that actually became the progenitor for vampire genre. Now, that, of course, was going to be eclipsed by Mary's taking up of the bet of this challenge of Byron by writing Frankenstein. And she began to write this novel in 1816. You got to remember here now, a lot of things have happened to this young girl. She's only 18. And she wasn't following it until almost a year later. She finished it in 11 months in May. And while she was working on this, her life was, as it was unfolding, was as strange as a novel. Now, I mentioned to you that Mary was steeped in tragedy and lost two of her closest relations to suicide. Well, one was her half-sister, and that her name was Fanny Imlay, and she committed suicide in December. And then Harriet Shelley, she was found drowned. And remember now, Harriet Shelley, just to catch up, was Percy Shelley's first wife. And she, they think, committed suicide herself. Now, only a few days after they discovered Harriet's body, Mary and Percy were married. Now, Percy was denied the custody of his two children by Harriet. And now, we must remember, this is all the time while Mary Shelley is working on Frankenstein. All these events have taken place during this short time frame of under a year, 11 months. And you can see this, if you've read the novel, you can see how dark and death and doom and gloom, that is in that novel. That is the atmosphere. And maybe when we look at that, and you can see, especially with Harriet Shelley being found dead, possibly committing suicide, that this tormented Mary. And maybe the monster in Frankenstein, as Mr. Pierce points out so well, could be used as a metaphor for the destructive power of the unleashed passion between Mary and Percy. Because these things do affect human beings. You can pretend and go on, but when you have this certainly unconventional relationships in marriage, there's got to be problems. Now, you look at that same line that Mr. Pierce does, and you can also make a case that Victor Frankenstein's horror of the destruction that the monster has caused is a reflection of Mary's guilt at the consequences of her passionate affair with Shelley. And that's what I mean. There are consequences with these type of behaviors. And you could say that, allegorically, that reading this novel like that, Mary Shelley could take the role of Victor Frankenstein, and the monster is in the role of the illicit and destructive relationship between, of course, Mary and Percy. Because remember, this is, again, a very young girl that all this happened to. Now, we talked about all the tragic backdrops here, and this is why it's important, I thought, that we look at Mary Shelley's life, just, looking at the novel, because it doesn't negate the other elements of Frankenstein and take away from the story. Because there are many beautiful clues. There are aesthetic clues and philosophical clues that are in Frankenstein that were the roots of the inspiration that Mary Shelley had. One thing that she wanted to do, and it's in some of the older editions, is the title was called The Modern Prometheus. And you see that Adam's complaint in the famous Milton novel Paradise Lost, there was a relationship between the creator, the creature, and creativity. Now, remember that Prometheus, he presumes to take powers that are not rightfully his in that story in order to create man. And in the Milton novel, we see that Adam's complaint in Milton's novel now is one of defiance. Because he asked, did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? So Adam's complaining about the creation of man as a defiant man. And Prometheus, what he's doing is, this is man just like that from Milton, saying, hey, I'm going to take these powers to create man. So we're going to throw it back in your face, all you gods. And therefore, when we look at Victor Frankenstein in the novel, he, through Mary Shelley, is the Prometheus figure. He's going to play God. He's going to cross a line that we should never cross. And of course, the Frankenstein monster, she's going to look at Milton's Paradise Lost, and when Adam complains about that, you see the Frankenstein monster is going to complain about being created to Victor Frankenstein. So here on one hand, you have Adam complaining and defying God who created him, and then you have Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel, who is the creator. And both are at odds. Now, one thing I want to point at, now the biblical Adam, as we know, we've got to be very, very careful here. The biblical Adam, I want to make clear, especially for those listening to the show that are not familiar with the faith and religion. In the Bible, Adam does not rebuke his creator. Let me make that clear. Adam does not rebuke his creator for bringing him into existence. Now, at most he blames Eve for the fall, if you know the story. But he does not rebel and take a stand on his creation. He is glad he is alive. He is glad that God has given him life. Now, Milton's Adam does not. So we've got to make that clear. So we want to make that clear in Paradise Lost. That's a different take. Milton's Adam is more or less like Milton's Satan. And Milton had his own theological prejudices, and they were, he separated himself from Orthodox tradition. Now, don't forget, he was this Unitarianism, which is, Milton was part of, was looked down upon both by Protestants and Catholics. Now, Milton's father, in his novel Paradise Lost, he appears to be like a dictator. And consequently, Satan is a freedom fighter. And Jesus, of course, in the Bible, we know is loving. He's the Savior of the world. He sacrificed his life for us so that we would free from sin, and he opened up the gates of heaven. In Milton's novel, he's just cold and arrogant. He's just the Father's son, but he's nothing like Jesus. So, this is Milton's Christianity, and I use that term sarcastically. And we have to be aware of that, because when we're discussing Frankenstein, these were issues that Milton had. Again, he wasn't Orthodox, and, he was taking shots. But this was part of Mary Shelley's imagination at this time in her life. So, reading Frankenstein purports, if you look at it from that view, as an attack on Christian orthodoxy, So and she may not have known that or not. And she may not have been reacting in her own way of Christianity. But you have to be careful with those reading of it, because she may have, she may not have. But these were the influences that she certainly was influenced by. So, again, she may not have been reacting against Christianity, but against the pseudo-Christian heresy of Milton. So we kind of want to give that caveat there. So, in other words, any reading of Frankenstein that purports to see it as an attack on Christian orthodoxy understood by, say, Protestants and Catholics is a wrong interpretation of that. So we want to be clear about that. That's very, very important. She was not attacking Christianity, and many people in today, it's 21st century, that's what I meant. They co-opted to say that, and she wasn't, not as we understand it. And that's a wrong interpretation to use. So we don't want to use that interpretation for Mary Shelley's novel. Now, let's take a look at some of the highlights of the novel. Now, I mentioned Prometheus, and he is famous for his creating men, and that's the mythic one. And the modern Prometheus is infamous for creating the monsters. See, they're both tormented, these mythic and the modern, of what they've done. So they defy, basically, in these myths, the natural. And that's what Mary Shelley is doing in Frankenstein. She was deeply concerned that the scientific age and the industrial age were going to change the way people believe morally and the way they live, which, in fact, we can see that these things in steps came to occur. There's a part in Frankenstein where she talks where the Victor Frankenstein's cousin, Elizabeth, writes about how farming is the greatest job that a person can do. You're in with the earth, you're creating something good, feeding people, as opposed to the science that Victor Frankenstein was involved in. So we must remember then that with all the modern interpretations of this, I mentioned about, co-opting this to say that Mary Shelley attacked Christianity. And again, that was Milton's deal. So if Shelley was influenced, she may not have known that. But anyway, Frankenstein basically, as Dracula, as we talked about, represented the good versus evil. Frankenstein represents a story of rebellion, and rebellion by creatures. Now, we know the greatest rebel was Satan, and he got kicked out of heaven with a third of the angels, the third of the demons that chose to form, for he would not serve. So, when we look at the novel, Victor Frankenstein, the creator of the monster, he's a rebel, and he's a victim now, because he's going to become a victim of that rebellion. Because Victor Frankenstein, as Mary Shelley portrayed him, and this is what her warning was of science, that science would become bigger than God. That it would become a God itself and go to places that mankind never should. A quick side note here. Electricity, which of course we know in the novel and the movie, the famous movie Frankenstein with Boris Karloff, is used to bring the monster to life. Well, in Mary Shelley's time, electricity was just beginning to be in use. And people were entranced by it and thought at that time that was the way life was created. And what did they think they could do with electricity? You guessed it. Create life. So you can see the ties of this young girl who lived a very unconventional life, steeped in tragedy, worried about the industrial revolution and science both getting too big for their britches could cause a great deal of destruction for mankind. And that was what she wanted to purvey. Because mankind would be enslaved by, or could be enslaved, rather, by science and the Industrial Revolution. The master, in a sense, would become the slave. Now, we know that when we turn away and take things out of the natural order, we pay. And Victor Frankenstein, as I mentioned, is a rebel and a victim of rebellion. And you see, he is going to make this creature. He's going to play God. He's going across a territory that should be only reserved for God. And therefore, when he creates this monstrous offspring because of his sin, Frankenstein creature, the monster, is going to be very much made in that image and likeness of Victor Frankenstein. That's why Frankenstein is the quintessential mad scientist story. It's infused in that novel that people do not respect and recognize that there is mystery in the supernatural world, that there is sacredness in the natural world, that there is power in the supernatural world, and, there is sacredness in the supernatural world. And when you cross that bridge, Frankenstein shows what can be consequences. I mentioned that Mary Shelley was living in an enlightened age that grasped science as a way of solving all their problems. This was it. I mentioned electricity was the secret to life, and they had discovered it, and great things would happen. Man could become a god. He could not serve. He could create paradise on earth. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, art has everything to do with emotion, inspiration, and sacred mysteries. That's why the Catholic Church, one of the things that they complain about the church is, well, why don't you use some of that money to help poor people? Well, they do. The Catholic Church throughout history has done so many things for so many downtrodden people. We could sit here for hours talking about it. But we must realize, when you look at the art in the Catholic Church, when you look at the music in the Catholic Church, the structures of the churches themselves, when you walk in there, your spirit is elevated. It soars to its creator, God. That's why it's so important to have the art. That's why we need art in our faith. It's not trivial. It's extremely important. And art is extremely important in our lives. Before they do that to us, they take us out of the material and elevate our souls. And science can do good things and great things when it works in conjunction and doesn't step outside realizing and try to prove that everything you experience or see is the only thing that's real, and there's no metaphysical aspect of our lives, that there is no mystery. That's where we would get into trouble, because there is a great deal of mystery. Matter of fact, science now with the DNA coding and discovering all kinds of new things are showing that we certainly don't have all the answers. There's something so far above us, and that's exciting. And when we look at it, you see the Frankenstein monster. It's kind of a reverse mirror image of our relationship to the supernatural. Now, God is the perfect maker, and he created man. Victor Frankenstein is an imperfect maker, which means that's what we are, imperfect makers. And what do we create? Well, we don't create what God did. We create monsters. You see, God created out of love. He did not have to create us. He created out of his divine love for us. And the Frankenstein monster is nothing more than a child of human pride. And one of the things that we see in our modern world today is that centuries past, man knew that his job was to serve his Creator, and in turn serve and wash the feet of his fellow men and women. But we're changing that around. We serve ourselves, and it's an unnatural course. And you see, then, we want to be master over what? Our Creator. And that's a very dangerous place for us to go. Very dangerous. Because when we create, whether it's through cloning or some of the research we're doing now, we can in turn create our own Frankensteins. And they will not serve us well. They will not serve us well because we are under that stain of original sin. So we don't want to cross the line. That is one of the strong points of the Frankenstein novel. We don't want to be God. And Victor Frankenstein, as I mentioned, is an imperfect creator. And therefore, because of that, and because this child he created is one of rebellion, what happens in the novel? I hope you read it because what do they call it? Spoiler alert, spoiler alert. That child that he creates out of pride, not out of love, not out of responsibility, no compassion, but of power, it's going to destroy his real family. And Victor Frankenstein is going to pay dearly. And the ones that he loves are going to pay dearly. And because the Frankenstein monster was not created out of love, he would be a slave. Because without love, being created, being divine children of God the Creator, we have that spark, even when we sin, to try and look to our supernatural Creator, to try to please Him, to try to serve. But when we do that when we create things, whether it be cloning or designer babies or whatever we're going to do, because the door is open here where we go, when they're created without love, as an industry, as a business, to gain power, we're going to be in for a lot of misery, a lot of hatred, and a lot of death. And that's just the way it is. And that's why I'm trying to say in the show today that Hollywood, modern takes on novels like Frankenstein and Dracula and some of the classics, you lose this symphony of the psychological, the spiritual, that are so prevalent during these novels, trying to make a point. And they're watered down by the modern reader or Hollywood making the movies, and we lose the whole point. Now, I said that Frankenstein is a quintessential mad scientist story, which it is. Like Dracula, though, it's a tale of horror. And when we read a Dracula, when we read a Frankenstein, or the classic novels, we need, as modern readers, this is so important, to look at the original philosophical themes that do make it tales of horror, that do make it terrifying, that cause us to think. And we've forgotten them. And that's why it's important that we look at Dracula and Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, not in just horror pieces or monster pieces, because intellectually and psychologically, these stories are trying to do so much, much more. So much, much more. They're trying to get us to look inside ourselves, see our place in the Creator's world, what our mission in life is, what boundaries we have, what boundaries we should not cross, what lack of love can certainly do in creating literally monsters. You know, when we look and see that these characters in the drama, and this is what we need to, it's essential in them, is that they're more profound when we look at, and that's why I recommend the Ignatius critical editions of Frankenstein and Dracula, because they stay on that course, that profound imagery, that profound point being made across through the novels, that, as I mentioned a minute ago, is just, you know, our culture has kind of just made it kind of banal. And when we look at the differences, and we could see that those who love, that those who serve, rather than prideful, and those are enslaved, you see that that's the difference between happiness and misery, and that comes through in the novel. Because that creature that Victor Frankenstein creates, as we said, is going to create a tremendous amount of tragedy in Victor Frankenstein's life, because he rebels. And that is the danger we need to look at, that Mary Shelley was trying to bring across. We cannot rebel. Again, she had such an unconventional lifestyle. And you know, the sad thing is, you can see that Mary Shelley, in all authenticity, probably wanted a normal marriage and normal values and a morality that was very basic, and to live a simple life with the land, and not for man to overstep those boundaries. Because the difference that we have in being created by God is not being an accident, as some people think, is that we have a Creator who is infinite good and has infinite compassion. And if we take the place of God, and many people today in our modern culture think that we could create our own paradise here on earth, we're going to have a lot of trouble, because we're going to create a race of monsters that isn't made out of love. And who knows where we go from there. And we've got to be very, very careful with that. Because when we see that this tension that we have between our Creator today and why we want to create, why we, whether it be science or knowledge or the technology we have today, where we are going to replace Him, we're going to lack all those qualities that God gave us that made us human. And that's a place where, Mary Shelley, years and years, when she wrote this in the 1800s, she was trying to say, hey, wake up here and be careful that we don't lose our humanity by the finds that science at that time was making and the industrial age that would just reduce us to a cog in a wheel. And that is something, that's food for thought, what we need to do. That's what we need to do. And, this young girl on this challenge, as I said, you look at all the influence of her life, and she got caught up in them. And like all of us, she was a sinner. And she wanted just to have that normal life, but she got caught up in this sea as just a young girl. And I think we need to look at the arguments that she made in Frankenstein. So that is a way for us to approach these novels when we look at this horror genre, which is why I wanted to bring this together in Dracula, which, again, a quick summary here, I wanted to show that, it relied very heavily on the Catholic sacramentals and that imagery of the religious aspect of Dracula in that whole thread of good versus evil. And, with Frankenstein, it's the Christian parts aren't really depicted. And we have to look at it when we read the novel also in that vein. There is something that are in the novel, but too, we got to remember at that time we wrote, there was a lot of prejudice against Catholics at that time, and so as in Dracula, I had mentioned that Bram Stoker was careful about that, but he wanted to show the hypocrisy of the prejudice against Catholics at that time, because he was able to use that in his novel, that wasn't a way to behave, whether you're Protestant, if you're Christian, you're supposed to love your fellow man and not, hate him. So, very interesting concept in Stoker's novel. Also with Frankenstein. Again, not the Christian symbolism that you see in Dracula, but there is a philosophy there that Shelley is trying to bring out. And that man has to be careful with his science and with his industry. And she took up that bet, and she did really, really well with it. And Frankenstein has become a classic that I encourage you to reread and look at some of the things we talked about on today's show, and you'll have a different interpretation of the novel. Because when you look at Shelley's life, you can see, her brief biography went over, influence it. There's psychological aspects of it. There's social, political, philosophical. So you can take a look at all these things and see what she was trying to say and go from there. And there's some good articles. If you do get the Ignatius press version, you can you can see they have some essays on in the back that are really well done that point this out, and you could, approach this in a different light. So I think you get a big kick out of it if you read those books now, Dracula and Frankenstein, with that being said. And if you get those two Ignatius Press, you'll be able to see in those essays that are very, very important. Because, we're coming there to a time now in our society, in our lives, we see a great deal of division. And this division does not come from God. Many people now, and you don't have to be Christian, you don't have to be a person of faith to see that there is something going on, not just in the United States, but across the world. And it's almost, and people have alluded to this dark cloud that hangs over us. That there is some type of evil. And that there is, brothers and sisters, that there is. Now, from a faith perspective, I do call that Satan, and I do call that evil. And he's on overtime. Because many people I've talked to, and you hear the same thing over, I just can't believe this is happening in my lifetime. Boy, it's crazy. It's like the world's cracked up. And one news story that you see on a Tuesday, the next day you see something that just is even worse than that on a Wednesday, and people just can't believe these things are going on. But, we deal on this show with the supernatural because there is an afterlife. There are angels. There is a God. There are demons, and there is a Satan. And this battle has been going on for a very long, long time and will continue to go on until the last day. And that's when Jesus will come and justice will be done and all the wrongs will be set right. And those who have followed him, who recognize him as the Creator, who have that humbleness and humility, will be with him in eternity. And those who wanted the pride, who wanted to be like Victor Frankenstein and create life and a paradise here, well, they may be in a whole world of trouble. Because demons do exist, and Satan does exist. And it's important for us to remember that he has nothing, even those that have followed Satan, he has nothing but their destruction and all human beings. Their destruction. That is his goal. And it's not just man and women that Satan hates. He hates all of God's creation, and he wants to destroy it all. And we must be on guard for that. We need to start having discernment, to look at our lives right now, to look at the time frame in history we are living, you and me, and look at it with an eye from eternity. This is very critical, I feel. Because when we look at that, when we look at it from the eye of eternity, you can start to discern what's going on here. You can see the battle between good and evil. You can begin to see how demons influence people, even if they don't know they're being influenced to do what they want, and bring about policies and bring about destruction that man, in his hubris today, may form in a way we've never seen. And that says something, since we've seen so much carnage. I mean, human beings have done some pretty bad stuff to each other. And if we don't get a grip on this, if we don't have that humbleness and humility to realize there is more to this life than what empirically we can touch, feel, or see, we're going to be in big trouble. Because it seems that's where we're heading, toward this naturalistic view of life, where we were created as an accident, and the cosmos will be nothing more than a complete collapse of itself. And nothing we do can change that. If we tend to you believe that worldview, worldviews, make no mistake about it, are important. If we believe in that we're just an accident, there's no purpose to our life because it all is going to come crashing down, and we create a community like that, we're going to have nothing but grief. Nothing but grief. Because everything is hopeless. And we will try with a naturalistic worldview of trying to stave off the impossible by creating human beings, by trying to get nature under control, by all these plans to stave off the inevitable. And in the interim, we will destroy people because then they have no purpose. They're an accident. There's nothing after this. We have got to stop that type of worldview and realize a worldview that is outside of ourselves, that is supernatural, that is not empirical. There's much, much more than what our senses that we see and hear can testify to, that we don't know it all. No matter how big we get in our technology or how many advancements we make in the scientific world, that we will never be God. We will never be the creator. And if we try to be like Victor Frankenstein and do that, remember, in that novel, he paid dearly. And those around him that he loved paid dearly for his rebellion. And the lesson, it seems, that each culture, that each civilization, that each person, in a way, doesn't learn over time, is that when we rebel against our Creator, we're going to pay dearly because of our own free will, because of our own accord, because of what we miss. But when we have a worldview that in humbleness and humility realizes that we are not God, that we have purpose, that we are not an accident, you're going to have a community then that thrives, that looks out for its fellow man, that realizes his place in the natural order, in the natural law, not the unnatural. And that's when we start to bring God's kingdom, his will, as it is in heaven, will be done on earth. And we will be blessed. And great joy will await us. And we will have peace and justice. But until that time, we have that humbleness and humility. We must watch and be careful we don't cross the line between the creature and creator. Or we, in a like turn, will sow those fruits. And we won't like what we sow. So, in this time we live, brothers and sisters, pray for humbleness, pray for humility, pray that we have the discernment to see from the eye of eternity, and pray that we can have a worldview that honors God, that knows that he is the Creator, and our place is to love him and to serve him and to serve others. And then you watch how the culture changes in such positive ways, and such happiness will be astounding. Good night, and God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.